Bonnie Watson Coleman. I'm Jean Durbin, president of the PCDO. I'm really honored to present this evening's program in partnership with the Princeton Civil Rights Commission. Can you hear me okay? Can you nod?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yep, all good.
Okay.
Anything.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So this evening we have Brandon McKoy from the New Jersey Policy Perspective. We have Nick Sutter, Chief of the Princeton Police. Mayor Liz Lempert will open with a few words, and Michele Tuck-Ponder is our moderator, former Princeton mayor and current school board member. And Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman is on the line trying to get in, which that will happen soon. I wanted to say a quick thank you, Bill Schofield, Chris Fistanich, Patty Saul, and the Advocacy Committee of the PCDO for their technical support, for the drafting support and the resolution that we're voting on. If you're a member and you received a link to vote, please do. It's an important resolution for us on race, equity, race, justice, and equality. Mayor, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jean. I just wanted to come on briefly to just thank the PCDO for convening this meeting tonight, and also thank the Civil Rights Commission for their work. Our country is facing a number of huge challenges right now, which have been exacerbated by a total lack of leadership from the White House. There's the global pandemic, the economic fallout, and the subject of tonight's meeting, racism, racial injustice, and racial inequality. And each of these crises are enormous on their own, but they're being magnified and made worse by the fact that they're all interrelated and interconnected. Black Americans are more at risk for bad outcomes from COVID because of higher prevalence of underlying health conditions. And scientists tell us that those underlying health conditions are caused in part by the day-to-day stress caused from living in a racist culture. So that's why last Monday, Princeton Council passed a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis and committing to a number of steps. And that resolution came about through conversations with Mayor Sadaf Jaffer from Montgomery. And she's working on a companion resolution in Montgomery Township. And we've pledged to work together and to share information on this initiative as we move forward. Also, the Civil Rights Commission is going to be arranging for a series of community forums, much like tonight's, and listening to each other and grappling together with the best ways to move forward is going to be essential here in Princeton. I did want to let everybody know that we have signed on to the Obama Foundation's Commit to Action initiative, which involves a commitment to reviewing our use of force policies, engaging the community, reporting our findings, and implementing reforms. And you'll hear from Chief Sutter tonight about some of the work that our department is already doing under his excellent leadership. But we know there's a sickness in this country, and to this day it causes pain and anguish and frustration and death at the hands of the state. And in a democracy, we are all the state. And each of us has a role to play here as individuals, as members of the community, and as Democrats. And I hope we can rise to the current moment so we can create a better and fairer Princeton and a better and fairer New Jersey, and one in which all residents can succeed and be healthy. So just want to close by saying thank you again to Jean and the PCDO for putting this exceptional panel together, and to everyone for tuning in tonight and for your engagement in the coming days and weeks and months.
Thanks, Mayor. And I'm trying to keep it brief so we can turn it over to the important subject matter, but I did just want to say, I know all of us are feeling grief and anger, and it's such a difficult time, but this is also a time for great hope. And hopefully tonight is one of those moments where we see hope and a road to a better place. Michele?
Okay. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining PCDO this evening for a critical discussion on the state of racism, justice, and equity in our town and throughout the country. I'm Michele Tuck-Ponder, former mayor, and Vice President of the Princeton Board of Education. And I'm excited that we're joined with a distinguished panel this evening to have an important conversation. It's going to, we're waiting for Bonnie Watson Coleman to join us. I think she's having some technical challenges, which I know you all know, living in the Zoom world, that's what happens. So we're just going to be patient, and I know Bonnie will be with us soon. Our Princeton Police Chief, Nicholas Sutter. Hi, Chief, how are you? And the
Evening.
President of the New Jersey Policy Perspective, Brandon McKoy. Hey, Brandon, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. So the way this evening's going to run, we don't have a lot of time, and so we're going to jump right to it. And we're going to open with brief, 3 minutes or less, self-introductions by the panelists, and then we're going to move into pre-submitted questions from PCDO members. I am going to ask the panelists to consider this a conversation and invite them to feel free to add any questions or comments, even if the question is not directly addressed to you. So I'll do my best to get all the questions answered, or as many questions as possible answered. And so with that, I will ask Chief Sutter to give us a brief introduction overview.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight with you. It's always my pleasure to be able to have these conversations. I thought very briefly, there may be many people that aren't familiar with me and my background, and I thought I would just start off by telling you a little bit about my background and how, as a police officer, my perspective on policing was formed from my early childhood, because I think it's important that you know where I came from, and I acknowledge how my background has affected my perspective on policing and communities. I grew up in a local town in very nearby here that was rural during the 1970s and 80s. The town was overwhelmingly comprised of white families at the time, much like mine. My interactions with the police at that point as a young kid involved a patrol car coming down the street once a month. And if I was lucky, I was outside, and I would run. I vividly remember running down my driveway, jumping and waving at the officer, trying to get an acknowledgement. Many times I did, and many times I didn't. I think what's important reflecting on that is, at that time, every one of those officers I encountered looked just like me. They were white males. And I think that's an important piece of this conversation on how perspective and diversity affect policing. I flash forward 15 years. I enter the policing in Princeton right on the heels of the Rodney King assault in LA. I can remember vividly as a young officer being very confused after my interactions with police officers, how communities around the country, including Los Angeles at the time, had such adversarial relationships with the police. I mean, I truly didn't have the capacity at the time to understand it, because that wasn't my experience. It didn't take me very long to realize in my policing career why that was, especially in minority communities. Minority communities have very different interactions with the police than I did, the one I just described. Over the next 25 years, as I sit here today, 25 years later, I've done a large amount of listening, a huge amount of listening and learning through interactions with the members of our community. I learned why they thought poorly of our police officers in general. And I vowed to make some type of change with that throughout my career. I guess the sad part of that is I entered policing on the heels of Rodney King, and 25 years later, I sit before you discussing the very same topics, and that's a failure. So I'm here to acknowledge that failure. I'm here to tell you that I have lots of learning and listening to do, and I think that's one of my major roles right now is listening, learning, and trying to form the partnerships that we can engage and have hope in that we're going to make things better moving forward.
Thank you, Chief. Brandon?
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everybody. It's a really big pleasure to be with you tonight. I hope you're doing well, and the fact that you're joining this on a Sunday evening really says how important this is to you. So thank you for joining. My name is Brandon McKoy. I am the president of New Jersey Policy Perspective. We are a quote unquote think and do tank based in Trenton, but we work on state level, statewide policies. So we do a lot of research, and we work with experts and organizations really across the country to do that research. But the do part is we don't just let that research sit on a shelf and gather dust and pat ourselves on the back. We get it in the hands of decision makers, the public, and the media, so that everybody understands really the complexities of various policy ideas and what we got to do to get them right. And so, we find ourselves right now in this country at an incredibly consequential moment. We have three crises all combining together. We have COVID, which no one should forget is still an ongoing challenge and is a major health crisis. We have the economic crisis and the recession, which actually we just learned this past week started before COVID, but was no doubt has been made worse by it. And we have, that has resulted in thousands of New Jerseyans, actually millions, losing work and being underemployed, which is creating a very difficult situation for so many of our loved ones and our neighbors. And then we also have the crisis of morality and racism that has been roiling the streets of the country for the past couple of weeks, but long before the founding. And so historically, these types of moments have significantly worsened inequality. They've resulted in a number of decisions and policy implementation that has really, I would say, not just left people behind, but pushed people behind. And if we are going to take our cues and learn our mistakes from the past, we really must make very, very different choices right now, not only to reduce gaps between groups and drive down poverty, but to secure a more equitable recovery for our state to ensure everyone has the resources and the supports they need to thrive, no matter who they are. And so that, to me, is four things in particular. That means finally taking seriously the idea that the budget, whether it be the state budget or the county budget or the Princeton budget, is a moral document, and we should act like it and make sure that we are structuring it in a way that it provides the help and the investments that everybody needs to be whole and healthy and safe. It means implementing a tax code that actually recognizes extreme disparities in wealth so that we can fund the things that we say we want to and make them real, because if we do not fund them, they do not exist. We can pass law after law after law, but we don't put money into investments, programs, assets, whatever it may be, services, they're not real and they're not going to have the intended effect. We also need to support investments that promote the building blocks of a healthy society and economy. And so that means things like public transportation, education, affordable housing, and more. And we need to remember that the economy is people, and we can't keep on leaving, or as I said before, pushing so many people behind. And so while this moment is incredibly challenging, and there are a lot of changes that need to happen with regards to public safety infrastructure and our public safety systems in this country, we should remember that public safety is more than just policing. Public safety is more than just healthcare. Public safety is making sure that we are making investments in communities, particularly communities of color and Black communities who have been left behind, pushed behind, and do not have the support they need to thrive. And if we make different decisions now, we can have a better future. And I'm very happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here too. So both of you, actually, and the Congresswoman, when she arrives. Chief, I'm going to give you the first question. Surprise, surprise. It's a two-part question, and here it is. Some of the biggest calls around injustice are because the law is built to protect the police, and so there's no sense of justice. Is there anything that you could envision changing that would create greater accountability or equity? And the second part of the question is, another challenge that keeps being noted is that challenges that officers face when they try to point out bad behavior. Some call it whistleblowing, other might see it as being good police officers. I know you mentioned this briefly in the council meeting on Monday. How can we move from brotherhood to community?
Excellent question. And let me start with the first part. I completely acknowledge the difficulties. I can speak to New Jersey. When I speak, I generally am speaking in the context of New Jersey. That removing problem police officers is not always easy. I venture to say it's not easy ever. There are, in my opinion, in my experiences, I feel it's been a problem for quite some time. From my perspective, there's a lot of, I think, a lot of history, legislative history, a lot of different things that came to bear that brought us to where we are now. But I see this as an area where progress is absolutely needed. If we are to rise above the problems that we have now, we absolutely, as a law enforcement culture, have to acknowledge and remove those that shouldn't be amongst our ranks. And make no mistake about it. We as officers, I speak for our department, the conversations that I have, we don't want those type of people amongst us. So I really feel that I think there has to be we have to kind of coalesce around this issue from a legislative perspective, from a law enforcement leadership perspective, and from a police union perspective. I mean, the police unions have to get behind this, acknowledge it, which I feel that has been occurring. I know locally it's there. I think it needs to get better. But I think we need changes in the process that we have to go through to remove officers. It's definitely not an easy thing to do, and I've experienced that. The second part of your question relates more directly to the culture of any organization, a law enforcement organization. At the council meeting last week, I read a piece of a letter that I issue to every new officer that comes on to the department. And basically that letter advises that new officer, that as they put on that uniform and come to work that first day, they may be junior in rank and time, but when a misdeed is witnessed, they're required by law and by our culture to take a leadership position and point out that misdeed and report it. And failure to do so is equal to the violation itself. It's seen in the same light. We make that a point from the beginning. And then I will just state, as part of that culture is recruitment. You've probably heard me say this before. I've said this for many years, and my leadership experience, my managerial experience has taught me that I can train the fundamentals of being a police officer. I can take a person and teach them and make them competent in their duties. Can't teach them how to be a good person. And we've concentrated on recruiting good, morally strong people that we want in this community. And I've said publicly that when we recruit an officer nowadays, this community has that officer for 30 years. And I don't take that lightly. Long after I'm gone, these officers will be here policing. And I take that as a very sincere responsibility. So I think you're looking at two different things. You're looking at legislation, changes in process, and then you're looking at how the law enforcement culture in each organization is built and how it's monitored. So I think there's two things that we have to look at going forward.
Thank you. And I just want to note that you've had two senior officers of color recently retired who are highly respected and had deep roots in the community. And so they're missed. So I will go to my next question, and that is with Brandon. And someone asked about your June 2nd column or your blog post, that talks about the wealth disparities in New Jersey. And I'll quote, Jersey is among the wealthiest and most diverse states in this nation, yet we suffer from some of the worst instances of residential and education segregation and witness racial wealth disparities that should embarrass every one of us. The median net worth for a white family in the United States is $171,000. For the median Black family, it's $17,150. That is not a typo, it is a tragedy. So the question is, of the 7 policy initiatives that you set forth to end white supremacy, how would you prioritize them? What's the most important? And do you have faith that our state will take action to implement them? Which is most likely to be reinforced first? Is this something that is going to happen? What would you recommend? I know that was a lot of questions.
Oh yeah, no, it's very straightforward. Thank you. So I do know that while we have a lot of incredible lawmakers in the state who recognize the importance of diverse communities and how that's a critical benefit of living in New Jersey, not everyone agrees. And these things will not happen if the residents of this state do not make their voices heard, do not make it clear that these are the priorities that they want to see implemented, and that they are tired of the excuses that have prevented these things from being implemented in the past, right? And so just being really aggressive and engaging the political system, both in the in the voting booth, but also with regards to following up with your representatives and saying, what are you doing to respond to this moment? How are you going to move forward and make sure you're being proactively anti-racist? And how are you making sure that the systems that run our government hold those values dearly and respect them and assert them in a reliable and sustainable manner, right? That's all critical. And I think legislators, a lot of the ones that I talk to, they'll say they don't hear enough from their constituents. And so if you think you're being a nag, don't worry about it. Keep on nagging. With regards to the 7 priorities that we listed in that statement, just to quickly go through them, one was equitable state and local budgets. One was closing youth prisons. The next was creating and enabling civilian police review boards in every community in the state. Next one was ending the prohibition of cannabis. Then expanding access to quality healthcare, especially for children, and doing that for everyone, regardless of their immigration status. The next one was eliminating exclusionary zoning ordinances that are basically effectuating redlining. And then the last one, but not least, was improving the health of our democracy by expanding the right to vote and reducing the influence of money in elections. And so these are all really big ideas, but they're not, I think for especially the folks who are, joining us tonight, that shouldn't be anything new. Those shouldn't be new ideas. Those should be things that I think a lot of people have heard for quite some time. And I think it speaks to some of the frustration that many feel that we're still talking about them and that we haven't really moved forward on them in the way that we like to. So I think the one that's probably most likely to be addressed quickly or more soon than the others is probably ending the prohibition of cannabis. That is on the ballot this November in New Jersey. That is something where I believe the question is just straight up, do you believe cannabis should be legal in New Jersey? There are some things that the legislature is going to have to do to make sure that it implements that law in an equitable manner, right? And recognizes the ways in which the prohibition of cannabis and the war on drugs have explicitly harmed communities of color. So I think just making sure you vote on that one, making sure you're voting in accordance with your values, and then following up with your representatives, because the details of that bill, from how do we ensure that those who've engaged in the drug trade before will be able to engage in the legal market now? How do we make sure that the tax rates, both at the state level and the local level, are going to be appropriate so that the revenue from those tax rates can be invested in communities to do some anti-racist programming and also make up for the ravages of the drug war. And then also just with regards to how do we make sure that the boards and the companies that are going to benefit from the legal market are diverse and have Black New Jerseyans on them. The one thing other than that I'll say, I think of the 7 that is the most crucial, and anybody who knows me knows I'm a broken record on this, but it's true, and I said it in my opening remarks. If we don't have an equitable tax code and equitable budget, it does not matter. It is not going to happen, right? And so, me and my colleagues and our tax analyst Sheila Reinerson just this past week put out a report saying that New Jersey could improve its income tax code, because right now, if you look at the share of income that people pay to state and local taxes combined, the very wealthy, the top 5%, pay a lower share of their income to state and local taxes than the middle class do. And so that's not progressive, that's not equitable. Making sure we are adjusting our income tax code to recognize disparities in wealth. Right now, if you make $80,000 a year in New Jersey, you pay the same income tax rate as somebody who makes $500,000. You know, we could do better than that. And so we put that forward, but having, I would direct people to, there's a great document by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which you can find at cbpp.org, CBPP, alliterative there. It's called Advancing Racial Equity Through State Tax Policy. And I know a lot of people sort of probably hear that and say, well, how could you do that? It lays it all out. It lays out how to recognize wealth, how to tax wealth, and how to redirect that revenue into the investments that we've been unable to make for far too long.
Okay, thank you. That's a great segue to a question for the chief, because Brandon brought up 2 things which I think are important. One is civilian review board for police conduct, and the second is about if cannabis becomes legal, and what kind of impact that's going to have in law enforcement. And how can we make sure that it's not disproportionate, that we don't repeat history with how drugs have been handled in terms of enforcement for Black people, and how we look at it as a country. Now it's a sickness, now that white people are suffering greatly in their communities. So I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Sure. So let me start with, I think the first part of your question was the Civilian Review Board. We're going to see statewide implementation of civilian review boards, in my opinion. It's been discussed. We've been talking about this for years. As I understand it, there's currently some litigation regarding a review board in the northern part of the state. I think once that litigation is settled, that you're going to see, we are going to see civilian review boards. What, in my opinion, the best way for them to be implemented is in a consistent manner from the state level. I think it should be done through either the Attorney General's office, through guidelines, directives, or we should have legislation passed. And the reason being, it needs to be consistent. I don't know that we want to get into each town coming up with processes that are different from the town right next door. I think that's there's peril involved in that. But I do think that with regard to those these types of review and oversight, I don't think they're bad at all. I think they have a lot of it's another way to engage with the community and bring the community into their police department and running their police department. I think selection will be very important. And I think there should be, processes set out at the state level on selection. Training, there has to be, again, in my opinion, mandated training that is consistent throughout the state. Oversight is super important, how the panels are reviewed and monitored. And then the process. I mean, the process, I think that may be the most difficult piece of instituting this type of civilian oversight. There has to be changes with regards to the internal affairs process as it currently stands, and with regard to the laws that surround the privacy, if you will, of internal affairs files. That's going to be, in my opinion, the biggest hurdle to overcome. I have a strong feeling, if history is any indication of what the future holds, that unions will oppose that. as they have in other states, and I'm sure, and as they have in New Jersey. So it's complicated, but I think it's a step in the right direction, implemented properly. I think it would give the community better trust, or more, allow them to have more trust in what we do and legitimize what we do by having a say in how we are policed, or how our own ranks are policed. So I think it's going to happen. It's a matter of getting through kind of these legal hurdles, which always seem to be a big problem in New Jersey. And then the second part, your second question related to the legalization of cannabis.
Correct.
And how that will affect policing, and how we're going to police that. So we've been involved in training and conversations with the Attorney General's office and the prosecutor's office for quite some time with regard to this. I have to say, I think I don't see it as being, it's going to be welcomed by law enforcement in certain ways. I think that it has posed problems in the terms of disproportionate arrests on certain communities, for sure. And that's a fact. I think that the amount of time and personnel hours that are spent on processing and investigating these crimes is going to help. It's going to reduce that and help our budgets. So I think there's a lot of positive things that are to come out of it. I will say I'm concerned, certain things from a law enforcement perspective that I would just mention is I am concerned about driving and how it's going to affect impaired driving. It's a concern of mine. And then I'm concerned, and I'm not an expert on this, but in things that I've researched, I am concerned about any addictive issues. I know there's research on both sides, and I'm not informed enough to really speak directly to it, but it's a concern of mine. But I think these are all things that are being discussed. And ultimately, I see that on the horizon, and I think law enforcement has no choice but to embrace it positively and work to implement it.
Okay. Thank you. So Brandon, we have a question from one of the PCDO members around racial literacy, which is of particular interest to me as a Board of Education member, because we have some racial literacy classes in our Princeton public schools at the high school. And the question is, can the state mandate racial literacy in our public schools and enforce mandatory training for our educators with continuing education requirements? And same question for our state licensed attorneys and other licensed professionals. And I would be interested in hearing if you have any input on racial literacy education and whether or not you think it's something that would be effective for our kids.
So yeah, absolutely. I know, I'm Jersey boy through and through. I was born in Secaucus. I grew up in South Orange, went to Columbia High School, TCNJ for undergrad, Rutgers Blousing for grad school. So I am a product of New Jersey public schools, and a proud one. And there was a ton of, especially in high school, Columbia High School, a ton of curriculum there around the literature from Black writers, film from Black directors, and no shying away from the reality of our country's history. And I know that had a huge impact on me, and I think gave me a better perspective as I grew into an adult and was able to think about things from different views and from different positions in our society. And so I think anytime you can sort of have or create space for more conversations with regards to this topic, the better. There is the Amistad law that I believe was either just implemented or is about to be implemented in the state to ensure that students are learning about Black history in a more comprehensive manner. Is this something that should be pursued for adults? I think it's, it can be harder for folks who are past the age of quote unquote, traditional learning to, I think, be open enough to changing their views. But we should make it a point, and we should make it normal for folks to think of learning as a lifelong endeavor, right? And that we can always know more about ourselves, about our country, about our society, whatever it may be. And so I would definitely support the idea of racial literacy programs across various professions, especially for those who are in positions of leadership and those who are in government. If we're going to have the values that we claim to have in this state, and if we're going to champion diversity and say that it is, a benefit of being in New Jersey, let's dig into what that really means, and let's live that through and through. And I think there's a lot of folks in this state who can help us with this. Actually, right behind me, Princeton University's own Keonga Taylor. I got Race for Profit right here, right? And so, and this is a book that just taught me a lot about the housing industry and how it's worked over the past couple of decades. We definitely have a lot of resources here to do a great job of ensuring that everyone has a better understanding of how we got here as a country, how we got here as a state, to be honest, and what that means for the challenges that we face now and how we should move forward.
Don't leave.
Absolutely. Hey, Bonnie.
Finally, hey, Michelle. I still don't know how my sister-in-law just got me, and we tried every number, every account. I got in through my official account, so I have no idea how I was invited. Hey, Brandon. Hey, Chief.
Hi, Congresswoman.
Well, we're really glad to see you. I'm going to let you take a couple of minutes to get settled. We've asked people, and you can skip, everybody knows you, so you don't have to give us a biography. We're just in the middle of answering some questions. And Brandon, I was just asked a question about racial literacy. And one of the things that I would like to see, because I'm on the Board of Education and the whole Amistad law, is the enforcement of the Amistad statute. Because what happens is, I think there might have been some initial enthusiasm around it. I suspect, because I asked about it, and I don't think it's happening in as many districts as we would like to see. And one of the things I do believe about the demonstrations that we're having now is because young people know a lot more about the history of African Americans in this country than perhaps my age group of people do. So I'm hopeful that if Amistad is reauthorized or whatever happens with it, that there's a part of it that requires accountability on the part of school districts, because
Amistad is still in effect. There's an Amistad commission. It's just never been fully inculcated into the curriculum of all the schools. Because by now you would have expected to go from kindergarten to 12th grade with understanding Black history as part of the stuff that you're learning. It wouldn't have been just 1 month. It would have just been, every day you're looking at something, there may be an aspect of it that brings in the African American community. So it's become more event oriented and trained to trainers, but it hasn't become part of the curriculum. And so it doesn't have to be reauthorized. It has to be reimagined how to do it and then do it. It's been very frustrating for me, the Amistad, because that's at least 25, 30 years old.
At least. I was active and I was on that commission. So many years ago. So it is distressing to me that as a state, we haven't followed through on that. But we need to advocate for that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do want to start with you though, Bonnie, and so we can come up with some of your questions. And the first one was, do you believe that significant criminal justice and social justice reforms can be achieved at the federal level this year, or do we have to wait for Joe Biden to become president and the Democrats to take control of the Senate?
Well, you know, they passed the first step legislation, which was supposed to reform to a certain extent the criminal justice system, the sentencing system, and a whole bunch of stuff. But it really was a baby step. Cory Booker and I introduced the next step legislation, which is really much more comprehensive, and it deals with from your youth to your adulthood, to sentencing, to alternatives to incarceration, to eliminating private prisons, literacy if you are in prison, on and on and on and on and on. I think that because of the space that we're in right now, there's a good chance that that legislation, as well as some other legislation that gets at the systemic racism that has propelled us to this point right now, will be heard in the House. But I don't have any confidence that it's going to get heard in the Senate. And so it isn't just about getting a Joe Biden elected president, which is a good start. It's about getting a Senate that does its job as well. You know, the one thing, because I know we are talking about coming up on November, the one thing I just want us to remember is that if we succeed in getting who we want elected, then we've got to continue to hold that person accountable.
No,
We can't rest on our laurels and say, okay, well, we did it. No, history has shown us that doesn't work. And I think that this is a moral moment that is so comprehensive, that has like ripped racism wide open, blatantly in your face. And it's done it in such a way that it has stunned white people, African Americans, and other folks. And that the persistence of the protesting suggests that we're at a new juncture. This is a tipping point, and we should not only be doing the things that we're doing in response to the so-called Police and Justice and Policing 2020 Act, but we need to be dealing with the systems that have created these inequities, such as housing discrimination and dispersing poverty, and making sure that people have incomes no matter what, and making sure that they have access to health care. If you disperse poverty, and you build housing and you put people in housing throughout communities, then you ensure that the children of those families that get to move into those places get a better shot at an education that isn't overburdened by so many social and economic ills. And in New Jersey, A500 is still the fair housing law. It just needs to be implemented as well. And each municipality has its responsibility to take a fair share.
That's right.
And if we accomplish that, if we just accomplish fair housing, it would do a lot to elevate communities and next generations, because they would be exposed to educational institutions that spend their dollars on educating and not policing. And that have the latest technology and the latest buildings and things of that nature, and the highest of expectations.
One of the things I want to circle back on with your bill with Senator Booker is around qualified immunity for police officers, and that Republicans are saying that has to be in the bill. What's your sense about whether or not Senator Booker and you would be willing to amend that police reform bill?
Well, I don't think that any bill we ever introduce comes out the way we want it, and there will be some compromise. I think that's an important issue, and we should fight for it. When you have these situations, there's got to be consequences. People have to be held accountable, including the individuals who take someone's life in the course of doing their jobs as police officers. And I think that the elimination of this immunity issue is very important, because then you know that not only is the institution for which you worked liable, but you personally are liable as well. And so Republicans are pushing back on a lot of things. I mean, what are we talking about here? You know, we're going to be fighting for several elements of the omnibus bill on policing. If I had my druthers, I wouldn't eliminate it, but I'm just one member of 435 on one side and 100 kind of limping on the other side.
Chief, you have any view on the qualified immunity?
I agree with everything Congresswoman just said about accountability. That's the number one issue, is holding bad actors accountable. This last incident is, I mean, this was murder. This was the most egregious, it's not even misconduct. I don't want to use the word misconduct. This was a murder. I do think that qualified immunity is going to be a very interesting topic. And I'm very interested to see where national law enforcement leadership and national unions fall on it. I think there's progress to be made there. I do think that it's complicated. Let me put it that way. But in the end, I think the key piece of what we're talking about is accountability. And, you know, immunity does definitely, I have to say, limit accountability, especially in purposeful bad acts. I think the argument you'll get on the other side is what's commonly referred to acts made in good faith, where an action is, it might be a car accident, or I could come up with a lot of examples, and how that's going to fit basically a mistake that's not ill-intended. So it's interesting, and I think it's a pertinent topic. I really do, and I'm really interested to see where there's room to move here and to make progress, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements of the policing bill that deal with accountability, including the National Registry of officers who've been found to have committed misconduct in office, and hopefully that signals to other districts, other jurisdictions, don't hire those people. There's also a need for citizen accountability, review boards, reporting that has to come out, the data that's disaggregated by race and type of stop and sex and all those kinds of things. We need to create a system that is accountable on so many levels. And then people who choose to break the law, even in a blue uniform. And Chief, I agree with you, it's bad apples, but unfortunately, yesterday, a man was killed in Atlanta. And if I'm not mistaken, either the day before or today, someone else was killed. So while we're having these protests, while we're having this robust discussion, when I'm on these Zoom calls every day, 7 days a week now, this is still happening. So we have got to be bold, bodacious, and accountable. And people who want to do those bad things need to experience dire consequences.
I absolutely agree with you. I couldn't agree with you anymore. I just want to speak to one point, which is an excellent point you just raised, and is a problem in New Jersey. And it's the effect of officers that are identified as engaging in misconduct. We talked about this earlier, Mayor, about the process by which problem officers are removed and about the barriers around that. I know for a fact, and from experience and from talking to my colleagues, how often when these officers are going through the process of removal, they'll resign or leave
Right.
the department, and many times end up in other departments.
Mm-hmm.
That is a concern for all of us. It's a concern for us. We've got a lot of things in place that hopefully prevent that. We're on the lookout for that. But that registry, I agree with you. I agree with you. That makes things easier for me, makes things easier for leadership to identify this and never bring these problem officers back into a department after they've been basically removed without a formal process from a previous department.
And I just want to highlight the point about data. The Star Ledger did the Force report a couple of years ago, and it was incredible, but it was also remarkable that something like that had not been done yet, right? And that was sort of everybody saying, oh, look at this. But it took them so much work and so much filing for open public records requests to get that information. And, right now, some of my colleagues we're trying to do an index project where we're looking at disparities between different ethnic and racial groups throughout the state. And state data is not easy to come by. It is, and we were inspired to do this we have a sister organization in California, and they did something similar, and they got a lot of their stuff is based on data provided by the government that they didn't have to, file a records request for. It was just up on the website. For us, I don't know if anybody's, interacted with New Jersey state government websites before, but it is not easy to navigate. It is confusing, and there's just not a culture of transparency here. Right. And so when it comes to data, both making it available, but also making sure that it's available in a form and collected in a form rather, where we have the ability to break it down by demographic and really tell who is being mostly harmed or disproportionately harmed than others, where that's happening in the state. All that is critical, and New Jersey especially needs to take that charge more seriously. It's and a big block for us.
Absolutely. And the bill that we're considering has data collection requirements disaggregated, and it links federal funding to states and other localities. And you're absolutely right about the data needs to be available in a way that is easily accessible. And I think I've read this thing so many times, I don't remember everything that's in it. It's all kind of sort of jumbling together. But I think that is the intent, is to have it available, usable, and public. And that combined with more rigorous community involvement and oversight, that in adding it with more community policing and training and bias training and making sure that we're hiring the people. I don't think we do enough to ensure that we're hiring the right person at that time. And just like you take a psychological test to get on to the state police, and I'm aware of the fact that we were against those tests at a time when we thought they were used to eliminate African-American candidates. Used in the right way, could probably reveal things about a person who's being recruited into the academy that might be helpful in knowing where that person's heart is, what that person really believes. And I think that's very important.
And you're making a good point about doing it before they get into the academy, because you spend all this money to train somebody to be a police officer, and then you find out subsequently that they don't have the appropriate psychological profile to be a law enforcement officer. And that's troubling. It's troubling.
But Mayor, it's what I spoke to earlier. I spoke to this exact point. I couldn't agree with that. That is the absolute key, is that I am fully confident in our abilities to train and teach someone how to carry out the duties based on the hiring process of a police officer. What I can't ensure is who they are. In other words, without a good process, I can't ensure who they are as a person, what their moral fabric is, and that they're dedicated to policing in an unbiased way. And that's where these hiring processes, where a lot of our hiring process concentrates on the fabric of the person who we're hiring, not necessarily that they're at all walking through the door with the competencies in hand to carry out all of the functions.
Right.
That we can teach. So I've been saying this for years, and I couldn't agree more.
And one of the things I have a question from one of the PCDO members, and it's around the fiscal impact of COVID-19 and what that's going to mean for local budgets, state budgets, federal budgets. And we know that that means money's going to have to move around to different places, and things that are important to policing and a lot of other things in communities. Brandon was talking about this earlier, that the dollars will be shifted from there. So Chief, if you could talk for a second about what kind of training or what kind of expenditures that you might be losing or are in jeopardy if there are significant budget cuts. And Brandon and Congresswoman, I want you to jump in too about, if we could look ahead 5 months to a year, what's this going to look like?
So I have to speak directly to training. As far as budgeting, that's a place where I would argue I would cut from almost, or probably I would cut from any other line item in my budget, our budget, other than training.
Mm-hmm.
Training is other than recruitment, training is the fundamental piece to ensuring that the officers that are policing your communities, our communities, are have the understanding, all of the things that are sometimes not teachable necessarily, that they have an understanding of implicit bias, for instance. When I came on the department, I was never informed. I had no idea what this was. As an older officer, I enter into this training, and this whole new world is opened up to me. So we train, just in 2019, we trained in 90 different areas of specialty areas, including all types of de-escalation tactics, cultural awareness, and implicit bias, just as a piece. But we move monies around in budgets all the time, but that's one where I would have to hold really firm and say, if anything, we have to do more in training. And I think as part of this reform that we're going to see moving forward, I would expect that to be a high concentration.
So the HEROES Act, which is the fourth iteration of a response to the impact of COVID-19 on states and hospitals and communities and people and whatnot, has $500 billion in it for states to not only respond to the expenditures associated with the virus, but also a response to the revenue which was lost because businesses were shut down, because tax collections were deferred and things of that nature. It also has another $375 billion in it for local municipalities and counties for the same reason. In the first tranches of money that came out, New Jersey didn't fare well because New Jersey, the money was geared towards other places. Let me just say that. And New Jersey had not only expended a lot of money dealing with the virus and dealing with PPE and keeping people on staff so they could, first responders, police officers, but New Jersey suffered tremendously from the revenue stream being dried up because the businesses weren't operating, people weren't buying, money wasn't being spent, and money and taxes weren't coming in. So the $500 billion that we see here in the HEROES bill, which is the bill that we passed that the Senate is trying to figure out, would, I think, mitigate some of those cuts. because that money would be intended to deal with education, housing, other issues, healthcare, other issues that the state has responsibility for, as well as the counties and the municipalities. If for some reason we don't get that, I think New Jersey would get something like 1.4 billion. That's just for the state, right?
Yeah, that's not gonna cut it.
That's just for the state. That's not for the counties and the municipalities. There's a separate, there's a separate category of $375 billion for them. So I don't know, what does that mean? The governor's been asking for
20. He's been asking for 20 billion.
You know what? I'm sorry.
No,
I think
you're right, though.
Yeah.
I think you're right. So, I mean, you're right on, Congresswoman, about like there's some monies that's been put aside in the HEROES Act, which still hasn't been passed. And so, what the urgency around that act, at least in my opinion, has changed and has lessened the more that we have understood that COVID has been having a disproportionate impact on Black Americans, right? And I think that's a tragedy, but it seems to be a reality. And when New Jersey went through the 2008 Great Recession, 2008, 2009, within 2 years, our state budget took an $8 billion hit. We went from a $41 billion budget to a $33 billion budget. And we had received from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act $12 billion, but that went to a whole bunch of things beyond the state budget as well. Right now, in this moment we're in, Treasurer Moyo put out a statement saying that we expect to lose $10 billion or more over this and the next fiscal year. And so this is a bigger drop, a bigger challenge. And it's a moment where we need more from the federal government, and it's going to be hard to get it because of who's representing up in the White House. And so there's a lot that New Jersey can do. We're not going to be able to raise $20 billion in revenue on our own here, for sure. But we can make changes, like I mentioned before, to the tax code, to at least do as much as possible on our own. And every dollar that we raise is a dollar or less we got to expect from the federal level, right? And hopefully that will make things better. But we are in, if people remember, the Great Recession was very challenging for our state. Our state had one of the slowest recoveries in the country. It took us 10 years to get out of that. But it took us 10 years because we had a largely cut spending, cut taxes mindset. We need a balanced approach this time around that includes raising revenue, raising taxes on those who can afford to do so, and honestly should be doing so from a moral standpoint. And if we have a more balanced approach, maybe this recovery only takes 3, 4, 5 years and not 10 years.
I also think that everybody's thinking right now, I think you're absolutely right, Brandon, no question about it. And there are those pockets of money to get in New Jersey. Just go for it. But I think that everyone's kind of focused on how do we get out of the emergencies we're in right now, both with the virus and with the reform to the policing that needs to be done. We got to think beyond that. Because I think the federal government has a responsibility to be in the COVID space longer than just the next 10 months. Because this virus, we don't even know what this virus is going to do. They can't even tell us whether or not it really is safe to open up. And we're seeing that states who have opened up are having some spikes. They can't figure out what the spike in Arizona is from because Arizona's hot. It didn't open up its beaches. It didn't have a space launch that gazillion people were up against one another. So I think the federal government has a longer period of being involved here. With regard to whether or not finding out that Blacks and Indians in particular are disproportionately hurt by this virus and what impact has it had on the willingness to address it, I can only say that I don't feel that's happening from my side of the aisle, but I will tell you that there wasn't a desire to do any of this to any great extent from the Senate or the White House, period. And you looked at the first bill, there was second bill, there was a $500 billion package of money. We don't know who it's going to, and they won't tell us who it's going to, but you know who it's going to. There was a desire to do and a need to do an interim bill, and they didn't want to do anything that helped the states or the municipalities or the hospitals or the frontline workers or the families. It was about taking care of, the wealthier and the biggest of businesses. So we have a real challenge to get through to January.
Mm-hmm.
We do. I'm going to start wrapping us up. I have one more question. I'd like to hear from all the panelists if we can, and it's kind of the big picture, overarching question of what's next. Like we can't stay in the street forever, and so Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative has called for a National Reconciliation Commission on Slavery and Racism. And my question is, how productive do you think that would be?
I'm gonna let Brandon and the chief weigh in first.
Well, I would say, that's obvious. That's something that South Africa did when they, post-apartheid. And from what I read and hear about that process, it did a lot to heal wounds and make it possible for people to move forward. And you have the Nuremberg trials after the Holocaust. We've never had a reckoning in this country with our original sin. And so having an explicit moment to do that in a big way, I think is critical. I just wonder, do we actually have the guts to do it in the way it needs to be done, right? It can't be a show. It can't be, pomp and circumstance, and, just a circus. And I think a lot of things that have happened over the past couple of years in the federal government have been a circus. And so if we're going to do it, we got to do it right. And that's going to require involving folks who understand this history deeply, understand its current machinations and the way it manifests in our culture, in our economy, in our society. But that would be something that would be nice to see. But we can't even, move forward in a manner where we get a reparations bill just to study what reparations would be. We can't even do that. And not to do reparations, just study, how, if we want to do it, how would it happen? And so while, Professor Stevenson's suggestion is wonderful and something I hope to see, it's going to take a whole lot more pressure and a whole lot more pushing and a whole lot more power to get that to be a real deal.
Well, I don't know, Chief, did you want to speak on that first?
I was just going to add one thing that from a law enforcement perspective, that maybe it doesn't hit quite exactly to the question, but I think this is an important issue for police officers. I'm not going to quote this exactly because it's I don't have it right in my head, but I was at a training recently, and one of the statements made stuck with me, and it was something to the effect that we, as law enforcement, we have to look through the cultural lens of history to understand how the African American experience related to law enforcement, and how that affects our interactions today. We're going to learn from history. If we don't have as law enforcement officers, a understanding of that relationship, I don't think it's hard to move forward and make progress. So, to the extent that answers the question, I think it's an important moment, and that this would be an important step.
I think that Barbara Lee, and I agree with both of you, Barbara Lee has a resolution in that deals with healing. It doesn't say reconciliation, but it does deal with the issue of healing. I think that that's something, healing and respectfully understanding who we are and our value. What that represents is something that would be very helpful. I'm more of a person who just wants to get, I know that housing discrimination perpetuates poverty, which creates communities that are devastated and children don't get educated and police over police in a different way. Change that law and build those damn housing and put people in it. You know, I know that there are things that we need to do specifically, pass laws and enforce them, redirect resources into communities, make sure that families are do not go without having their fundamental needs in order to survive. Change education systems that value working with your hands and technology and making it available to people, making sure that folks aren't discriminated against when they try to get a job, and don't over incarcerate Black men and Black women and poor brown folks either. I mean, I'm okay with studying and discussing and, you know, having kumbaya moments and things of that nature, but I also know that we need to get about the work. And I don't think that the window stays open very long. I think that we're at a point right now where we need to reimagine who we are and how we're going to move forward, and then do it. Because I think that what people have seen most recently, and what you've seen in reaction to what they've seen, is what they saw was so stunning and inconceivable, to see someone lose their life needlessly in front of your eyes. And B, their response to it is the culmination of all the stuff that they've been holding in for so long. It just bubbled out. And now we've got, you know, we've got people all over the world that are protesting with us. And we've got, you know, some strange experiments happening even in the United States of America, over there in Seattle, Washington. But they're healthy. And so if it takes a resolution of reconciliation and healing, whatever, you know, fine. But let us be in parallel action with getting things done, changing policies, changing laws, enforcing them, putting our money where it needs to go, and ensuring that there's sustainability for all families. And you can't tell me you can't do it, because if you can take trillions of dollars out of the budget to give to billionaires and millionaires, you can take care of families and make sure that they have an income coming in, that they can live in a safe housing, they can have access to education and broadband and everything else they need to have, and they can have access to healthcare, and they can be treated with dignity and opportunity when it comes looking for a job. I'm just saying.
I agree with all that's been said, and I'm going to jump in, because those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it. And we must not know our history, because we keep doing this over and over and over again. And it's really old. And one of the things that I think is so critical, which is why I would endorse this, it's we can do it. We can do it well. We did the 9/11 Commission. We did that well. So we have the capacity to do it well. I think the thing that is stunning to me is people need to understand the brutality of slavery. I don't think that people really, they get a sanitized version. If you look at a textbook where kids are learning about slavery, they act like it went on for like a half an hour. And it wasn't that bad. They have no idea of the brutality of slavery, or the brutality that followed that period of slavery. Or the persistence. Right. And which we're still existing now, because the murder of Mr. Floyd was a continuation of that whole practice of devaluing the life of Black people. And that is just, to me, it's incredibly frustrating that we're churning out yet another generation of kids who don't know their history, and then don't understand why we're in the position that we are. And so, as I'm about doing things too and getting it done, but at some point we need to have a reckoning as a country, and people need to see it straight up and understand How do we get
Yeah.
from there to here? Because if we don't, we're going to keep doing this stuff.
Can I fact check myself on something, please?
Yeah.
Before you close out. Hey, Brandon, I think that I asked my staff about New Jersey's money in the HEROES bill, and it would be about 16.6 billion.
Yeah, that's a whole lot better.
That's
better. It is better.
That's north of where I thought we were going to be. I'm sorry, Michelle.
No,
You're
fine,
absolutely right.
I was getting wound up. No, I'm glad you stopped me.
I'm actually fatigued by the conversations that I've had in the last couple of, in the last 2 weeks, because I'm talking to all the people who already get it.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
and I say that Mr. Floyd is definitely going to be the martyr here, but he'd rather be alive.
Yes, he would.
And the point that you make, Congresswoman and Mayor, about action, it's the same situation here in our state, right? There's so many conversations we've had over and over and over and over again. And, when it comes to reducing the racial wealth gap, we know how to do that. When it comes to, making sure that we're reducing gaps in education, we know how to do that. It has been a lack of political will and, honestly, political honesty
and courage.
And I can imagine how frustrated you all are. I've only been president of NJPP for a year and a half. I've only been here for 6 years. It is madness to me that we keep on having these conversations over and over again every single year. And, especially our budget process, we just think about things from year to year. We don't think about, where we want to be in 10 years, where do we want to be in 20 years? We just say, how can we get to next June? And as long as our mindset is just how can we get to next June, we're never going to deal with these challenges, these problems. But that's what it's been. Yeah. And more folks need to know about that so they can push back against a process and a system that exists in the state that does not prioritize long-term health sustainability and, quite frankly, people's right to joy and happiness.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
And with that,
having said that, can I just say that I think we're at a different point right now. Mm-hmm. I don't think that this is the same kind of reaction to a situation. I think that we're at a tipping point now where it's just bubbling out and good people are standing up, and we got to make the best of it. And a long-term planning looking beyond this period is very important. You're absolutely right. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you. Thank you for being patient with my getting in here. I have no idea what happened.
We're just delighted that you're here, and delighted that the chief is here, delighted that Brandon's here. On behalf of PCDO, thank you guys so very much for taking the time. It's been an honor to spend the evening with you. So
likewise. Thank you. Good to see you all.
All right, good seeing you too. And thanks to everybody who joined us this evening. We're glad you came. So Jean, I'll turn it over to you or Bill, and I guess we're gonna wrap it up. You're on mute.
You gotta unmute.
Jean, you gotta unmute.
Oh, that was good. I wanted to say thank you. It's been a great conversation. It'll be recorded. We'll share it with the membership and beyond. And I can't thank you enough for your time and the inspiration and your good thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.
Have a great night.
You too.